This is the Hofstra Radio Alumni Audio Yearbook, Volume 2, and today is December 28th, 2023. Please tell us your name and the years you were at Hofstra Radio.
Hi, yes, my name is Mike D'Antonio, and I was at Hofstra Radio several times. I started as an undergraduate student in '82 and lasted till about '87. Left, went into the real world, so to speak, and came back in 2001, worked there till about 2006, took some time away, and came back in 2011 and worked there till about 2012.
Okay, so lots of stuff to cover here, but thank you so much for coming back and doing this again. It's always a great time talking with you. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Brian. I enjoyed talking to you as well.
Great. So just as a reminder, we talked about in our first conversation some of the positions that you had at the station, but just remind us of what you did at the station.
Sure. How long is your arm? Because it's really a long one. I started out doing continuity, which back then meant not only making sure that all the PSAs and promos were logged, but actually writing the PSAs and promos. Then I was assistant chief announcer to a girl named Carol Itzkowitz, who we also called Carol Brooks, and she was an interesting character. I loved working with her. Then I was one of the first executive engineers. They didn't have that position, and Mike Larkin, who was the station manager at the time, needed some help to corral in the engineers, he said. So he created executive engineer, and there I was. Then I did classical music director. I was not the first classical music director. I think it was Carl Bucking, Lynn Hamilton, and then me. But I was the first one who knew nothing about classical music, so I had to kind of learn it on the fly. And then, of course, we started the Classics from Hofstra, which was the classical music show that ran for 6 hours that began shortly before I started, but that's how I learned all about classical music. And I ended up as the PR director for a couple of years there, making sure that the station got some coverage on campus and off campus. I would write the press releases and public relations duties and things like that occasionally, coordinate an event, that type of thing.
Okay. So let's go back to the beginning for continuity director. And oftentimes there's one of two ways that people get into that position. One, they show up and they're eager to do something and someone says, "Hey, here's a great job that you know nothing about." Or there's the other sort of thing where like, "Well, no, I know what radio is about and I want to get in on the ground floor in this important thing." So where do you fall in that spectrum?
You nailed it on the first one, Brian. I mean, it was kind of like I walked in the door. What can I do? Oh, we need a continuity director. Here you go. They had
Feels great, right?
here's what the PSAs and promos look like. Do it. Okay, and I did. So there you go. Jeff Krause was the general manager back then, and he's had a lot of stories about him. But one thing he was a teacher, and he was a good teacher. But he had a style where he wanted you to try to do it on your own first before he taught you. So I did, and I displeased him, and then he showed me how to please him, and then I pleased him from there on. So it was kind of like that was pretty common with a lot of people. But it's a good way to learn. It's an interesting way to learn, and I did learn a lot. I learned more about keeping logs and writing promos and PSAs, because promos and PSAs I had heard all my life on the radio, so writing them wasn't that difficult. But keeping the logs was something that, unless you're in the business, you don't really know too much about. So that's really where my learning came in.
So you mentioned not getting off on a great foot with Jeff. Was it something about the way that you were writing PSAs or promos or the scheduling? What happened that there's a little bit of conflict?
No, not at all. It's not getting off on the wrong foot. It's that he had a specific way of wanting things, and if you tried to do it a different way, like if you phrase things in a different way, or if you used a term that he wasn't crazy about, he wasn't just kind of like, well, change that. He's kind of like, well, change that, and here's why, and that was fine. Actually, it ended up being a good thing. So I don't mean to make it say that he and I did not get along. We actually got along from day one, but it was just his style was very much like, there's a certain way of doing it, but you need to figure that out, and you need to make sure that the way you figure it out falls within my spectrum, and then I'll correct you and help you find the spectrum. So that's basically what it was.
Okay, and I think in a lot of ways, Jeff's manner and his style was that if he saw something in you, he would make sure that you got the information that you needed, or you get the right criticism. And as opposed to some people who are just there as a goof, he probably wouldn't put the energy in because he had a lot to do. But if he saw something in you and he saw a possibility, he'd make sure that you understood what he was looking for. Is that fair?
I wholeheartedly agree. He also didn't call people by their names. He called me PR for 2 straight years. So, but yeah, I got it. No, absolutely. You're right. That's so true.
Hmm. So you do continuity for, I guess, for a year? Is that right? For
About 6 or 8 months, yeah. And
Okay.
then while I was doing continuity, I was also helping out Carol as the assistant chief announcer, which basically was just kind of like scheduling the announcers and making sure that they got through their clearance. They had this clearance thing that they had to do. They had to read a certain amount of spots in a certain way, and she had to listen to it and approve it and whatever. So I would schedule their clearance auditions, so to speak, and then once they were cleared, make sure they got a spot, and worked with the program operations director and the other people who made sure that everything went on the air to make sure that these people got their spots and got on the air.
Okay. So was this for like staff announcer positions?
Yes.
Okay. So people who would come on someone else's show and read the public service announcements and promotions and things of that nature?
Well, not just that, but also in order to get a show, you had to be cleared to announce and to engineer. So to be cleared to announce it would be to clear to host a show. So a lot of times, it would not just be the staff announcers; it would also be the people who were potentially hosting a show. They had to go through a process also.
Okay. Was there a training class or was it just sort of here's some copy, let's see how you do?
Under Jeff, there was no formal training class unless you took the courses, which were separate. Those were,
Right.
he had writing for radio was a separate, the 3 credit course that you took through Hofstra, but you didn't need to take that. But if you did, it helped you. But no, there was no formal training class until Bruce's administration, much later. And I'll tell you about my life in Bruce's administration later on too. That was an interesting time.
Okay, okay. We'll come back to that. So let's continue along the line. So you do assistant chief announcer. You're getting people cleared. You're doing a lot of the behind the scenes stuff, and then there's another opportunity for a position that, like you said, was relatively new, but was nonetheless pretty important in terms of keeping the station running in a professional manner. So that was executive engineer. Could you tell us a little more about that?
Sure. Well, Mike Larkin, who was the station manager at the time, was a big guy on engineering. He wanted everything to sound a certain way, so he was doing all the engineering clearances at one time. And then basically, I was kind of his sidekick. He and I became very close. So when I started at the station, he had been there about a year or so before I was. So we developed a friendship and a mentorship relationship there. And he said, "Okay, well, you know enough about this now. You've been with me as I've done this enough. It's your turn to start clearing people and giving them spots." So that's what I did. We developed a system. They had to be able to do this segue and that type of a segue. They had to be able to know, what all the readings meant and how to take the readings and all that type of stuff. And if they passed through a certain amount of steps or whatever, they got their clearance and then they got their slot. And then I had to, manage their maintenance of that slot to make sure they were doing it over. I think it was the first 3 or 4 months until they finally were relieved of me and then were on their own, type of thing. And it was interesting because it taught me a lot about responsibility. It taught me a lot about dealing with a lot of other people and scheduling and all sorts of stuff that went in with that role. It was a great position to have. It really was.
Huh. So were you sitting in while someone was engineering, sort of keeping an eye on them, or was it just a check in on occasion and listen to their shows?
It was kind of organic, Brian. It depended. I mean, some people, from their first shot, from the first time you sit with them before they even get on the air and they go into a studio, you could tell if they've got some engineering chops or not. Usually, so
Hmm.
if it was a person who had some kind of a background, whether they worked in high school radio or whether they had previous experience on the air somewhere else or whatever it was, so you would treat them a little bit differently than the person who knew nothing about it at all. So if they were coming in dry, obviously, yeah, I'd spend some time with them and kind of watch over them as they did their shifts the first couple of times until I was confident enough that they were fully cleared to do it. I was the engineer on duty and they were kind of training under me, but basically it was they were working the board and I was kind of overseeing. And then after a while, they would go out on their own. And again, from time to time, I just check in with them to see how they were doing. But at that point, they were pretty much cleared and were able to do their engineering shifts as they wished.
Hmm. So I know you had some experience within the station doing continuity and the announcing stuff, but we talked about this previously that you grew up listening to stations like WABC and Dan Ingram, and you had a pretty good ear for what was good radio. I think you came into the station with an idea that you wanted to do commercial radio, so you must have had a good sense of what things should sound like. Was there guidance from Mike or Jeff or anybody else to sort of like, well, this is what it should sound like, or is that something that you pick up over time?
It's something you pick up over time. In fact, I think what they were trying to do is to have the radio station sound as non-commercial as possible.
Yeah.
because back then it was kind of a paradigm shift going on right around us, so we didn't even realize it. At the time, the station was not really in the best light with the university. It was kind of like this thing that happened to be at the college that the college wanted very little to do with. So we weren't too worried about sounding professional. We weren't too worried about sounding, commercial or anything like that. Nowadays, of course, it's a training ground for professional broadcasters. But back then, it was
Mm.
kind of like people who want to get into the business and have some fun and maybe do other things, but play radio while they're here. And I don't mean play radio as if to say it was sandbox radio, because it certainly wasn't. But it was a learning experience in how to do radio, and what you wanted to do with it after that was your business. But sort of towards the end of my time in the 80s, and then definitely when I came back in the 2000s, that had shifted, and it became something that was very much, directly towards like, this is how you do good radio. And it was interesting because I learned a lot from watching everyone else around me, not necessarily so much from Jeff and Mike and the people who were in charge then, but from my peers, the
Mm.
people who had been on the air for a while, and some of the newer people, and took their ideas and saw what they did. Of course, I kept listening to the radio at the time. I had outgrown WABC after a while, and I was listening to 99X at the time, and some of the
Mm.
Z100 was just starting to make a bubble now and whatever. So I was listening to that, and I was picking up on what they were doing and seeing how I could incorporate what they did into what we did, but still sound different. And that was it was a challenge. And then you deal with all these different formats on the air too, because at the time we weren't a 24-hour station yet. We were signing on at 8, signing off at 2 in the morning, and we signed on at 8. It was 6 hours of classical music after a while. Actually, at the beginning, it wasn't even that. It was 2 to 2. It was 2 in the afternoon to 2 in the morning. We had some public affairs, and then jazz, and then some rock into the evening, and a few other public affairs shows sprinkled in. But once the university got involved and started to treat the radio station a little bit differently, which was kind of about 84, I think.
Mm.
Then we hit the air with the classics from Hofstra, which meant we went on the air at 8 o'clock in the morning, and we had to be super serious because the president of the university, Dr. Sheward, at the time, had wanted a station that he could play in his offices, and so it was classical music and very dignified and things like that. So we learned how to be dignified broadcasters, and that was kind of neat. It was kind of a shift and kind of a change, but we went with it, and unfortunately, some people didn't end up sounding that way. But we found other homes for them. We found other homes for them on the station if they didn't. But a lot of people did, and a lot of people really picked up on it. And our news department was growing right around the same time too, so it was really good to get a good foothold on how to do news. And they had started this program called the Communicast News right around that time, which was a half an hour of news every night, which was the first time they had done that in a long time. They had one back, I believe, in the 60s and 70s, and then they dropped it. And then back in the 80s, they picked it up again. And but basically, we had almost no staff. It was kind of like, you had a few people who wanted to do news announcing, and they had rip and read. So you kind of had to do what you could with the AP stories and change them around a little bit and rewrite them. So it taught you how to rewrite a story. It taught you what stories to use. The little bit of live sound you could get, or the little bit of wild sound you can get from time to time, you brought in, and you just kind of played it by ear and figured it out as you went along. And then, of course, eventually we know how that developed into an award-winning news department at the station, which was
Mm.
great many years later. But it was interesting to be there kind of at the beginning of that thrust, and that's really, how you learn. And I picked up as much as I could. I hung out with some of the sports people for a while, even though I wasn't a sports guy. I learned from them how to do it. I picked up on their passion. I hung out with all the different format people. I knew about a show we called Rave Up, which was, really very kind of pop focused new wave. And then there was the post punk progressive pop party, which was the kind of underground new wave. And I learned a little bit about that stuff too. And then that, of course, evolved into a hip hop show, which is kind of sort of in one form or another been around for a long, long time.
Mm.
And it was interesting. They had a guy on Saturday nights doing reggae who I got to be somewhat friendly with, so I learned about that. So hanging around with the other show hosts and my college age peers taught me a lot more than I really learned, from the management at the station at the time.
So it's absorbing all these different ideas and sounds and styles, which is a great opportunity. And that's, one thing that's really great about Hofstra Radio through the years is a chance to try different things out and see what works. And generally, I'm sure there are a few exceptions, but generally people are open minded and like, oh, you want to try this out or you want to learn more, come on in, come to my shift or whatever. I think that's always been a constant throughout that people are always encouraging.
Oh, absolutely, no question about it. The doors were never shut.
Mm.
If you wanted to be involved, you were always welcome to be involved. Sure.
Mm. I'm going to test your memory banks a little bit here. You mentioned the evening newscast. Do you remember anybody who was involved with that, or perhaps a news director or anchor?
I'm trying to remember. Let's see. I think Andy Hirschhorn, actually, he was a sports guy, but I
Hmm.
think he did news for a while. Greg Fennell was doing the news. Greg Fennell was his name.
Okay.
And I ended up working with him in one of my first commercial radio jobs in New Hampshire, kind of ironically. Let's see who else was there at the time. I'm trying to remember some of that. That's going back a while.
Okay.
That's
Well,
going back quite a
let's
bit. That's fine. The names will come to me. They're just not coming to me right now.
Okay. Well, those are two good names to know and to remember. And then the classical thing, I wanted to double back with that as well because when I arrived in 1990, and my friend Mike and I came on campus and we heard the classical music, and our first reaction was, "Well, we're not doing that." And being I think we were still in high school, we weren't even at the university yet, but there was often a lot of resistance among the student body to doing the classics because it was boring or it wasn't what you were familiar with. But it was really quite an opportunity to expand the station and get more airtime and get more resources from the university. And it's as adults now looking back, we can go, oh well, that makes sense. But at the time, I think a lot of students were reluctant to get involved with the classics or perhaps with the station because of the classical music during the day. But it was really a chance for more people to be on the air and more resources to go into the station. What do you remember about that transition to starting at the classics from Hofstra?
It's kind of funny. I remember distinctly with going one day with Mike Larkin to WHLI,
Mm,
which was a station on Long Island at the time. I don't know if they're still operating, but they had donated their classical music library to us once they found out that we were going to classical music. So I remember picking up all those records and bringing them back, and we were having a discussion as we were doing it. You know, we're doing all this work. Are these going to be used? And they ended up that we had like this very full classical library that definitely got used for sure because 6 hours a day is a lot of music even when you're talking about these long classical pieces. It's a lot of music. And we were talking about how can we sell this to the students, and it was difficult. There were a handful of people that wanted to do it, and then along comes this man named Carl Bucking, who was
mm,
this British gentleman who knew a lot about a lot of things, including classical music, and he loved it. And he came on the air, and he just had this way about him that he made classical music fun, if you can believe that.
hmm.
And he was the first classical music director we had at the station. I think I mentioned that. And he, really kind of put forward the idea of looking at it in a different way. And then before long, after you stick with it for enough, and after the university helps you kind of promote it, because the university got behind promoting the station once that happened, because it was, the reason we went on the air was to help the station, to help the university and help the station at the same time. So they started, getting people interested in that. And before long, after a couple of semesters or so, we started to have people lining up to find out more about it. Now, again, it became one of the things that in order to be cleared for an air shift, you had to do a classical shift. It was
Hmm.
kind of like one of the things. Well, we know you can announce. Now we're going to give you a format within to how to follow the format and to see if you can do this. Also to see if you can combo, which was a big deal back then. Of course, everybody does it nowadays, but back then they would have separate engineers and separate announcers on some shows, and we tried to streamline things by making people engineers and announcers together. We called it
Hmm.
comboing. So it was an opportunity for them to learn how to combo with pieces that they didn't have to keep changing every 3 minutes. So that was another good thing about the classics. It gave people the opportunity to learn how to utilize the equipment, to learn how to do an air show, and really hone their talents. And after a while, it started to become something that, with the rare exception, people realized they why it was being done, and they didn't mind it as much. But
Hmm.
yeah, at the beginning, I also think because it was kind of like, oh, gee, that mindset. Now all of a sudden, now we're the university's friend after having this mindset that we were kind of like this counterculture thing going on. That went on for a while too. The fallout there, which was kind of like that initial negative reaction. But I think after a while, people realized it was a good thing.
Yeah, yeah. It's definitely a lot of students were of mixed mind about it. I remember I was very glad to have sort of the guardrails of the classics from Hofstra as I got used to being an announcer and engineer and then combo cleared. It was nice to be able to sit for 20 minutes and listen to a piece and then announce and then not have anything to do for 40 minutes other than watch the meters. It was actually rather comforting to me. And then But then there's also the thing of, well, this isn't what I would normally listen to. So I can definitely see the conflict, and certainly the pirate radio aspect of WVHC at the time, sort of, us against the world, definitely getting some mixed messages. But so this program's growing, and Carl's wonderful to talk to. And again, you said before, he knows so much about everything. He's such a knowledgeable and entertaining guy. But you get the opportunity to be classical music director. Was this something that was in your mind, or was it like, well, let's make Mike do this? How did that happen?
It was kind of both. I wanted more responsibility at the station, and Carl had done it for a while until he was confident that somebody else could take it over. A woman named Lynn Hamilton came along, and she was a music person, a music major. I think she was actually a jazz performer too for a little while there.
Mm.
And she got involved in the station by doing that, and then she moved on for whatever reason. I don't remember why, and the position came open. And they said, okay, well, Mike, here you go. You want to try to do this. You know a little bit about it. You've done the show for a little bit. Why don't you take it over? And I said, well, I don't know enough about it to do that. Carl's like, I'll help you out. I'll help you out, and he did, and it was fine, and it was cool. It was it was kind of like I think it was the sophomore by this time, but the sophomore wants to do it, so let him do it. So and that's fine. So I did it, and it was just kind of like I Brian, I tell you, I was a great student until I got to college. Once I got to college, I stopped going to classes and started going to the radio station.
Yeah.
So it was like anything to be at the radio station, anything to help the station, I wanted to do it. So I was happy to do it actually, even though I was a little trepidatious at the beginning, but after a while, it became okay.
So you're spending a little bit of time with Carl, getting to know sort of how to program things and put things together. And then was there a point where you felt like, okay, I kind of know what I'm doing here? Did you feel comfortable in the position?
Yeah, I think I held the position for the balance of a year, and I got comfortable in it. And then somebody else came along, and I think it was Nancy Zuckerman or somebody else took it over, and they took it with my blessing. It was a good thing to do, but I wanted to do other things at the station, so
Mm.
I handed it off and moved on. Uh, I could have probably ended up doing it for 3 or 4 years. I probably would have learned a lot more, but I think I learned enough about it and really kind of piqued my interest in it. And nowadays I'm recognizing pieces in movies and things like that. Oh, I know that.
Ah,
Yeah, and I wouldn't have known that without the classics from Hofstra. So, you know,
there you go. So you maybe aren't going to your classes, but you're learning things. You're getting an education, just maybe not what your coursework was.
right, exactly.
Understood. Understood. So then you decide to go for PR director. And again, was this something that you were interested in doing, or was it did someone point you in that direction?
Well, one of the things that I always saw from the beginning, even as part of the paradigm shift, we weren't promoting the station the way we wanted it to. We
Mm.
wanted it to be promoted, and a lot of us would meet and bemoan that. And I finally said, "Well, the heck with it. I'm going to see what I can do about it." And I just kind of got the steam started, and then the position became open, and I was asked to do it, and I did it. And like I said, I held on to it for a couple of years, and I think I did a pretty good job with it. I mean, by the time I left the station, more people knew about it at least, so that was a good thing. And I started to become kind of like the spokesperson for the station. I got people involved. I think I first met Tony Sabilla at one of my classes, and I said, "Hey, it was actually I think it was writing for radio. He was in the class, but he wasn't involved in the station.
Mm.
So I got him involved in the station, talked to him about it a bit, and then well, you know what happened with him. He became the station manager, and now he works for Music Choice and has made quite a career out of being. And he does some play-by-play as well. So he's made quite a career about being in the broadcast field. And so I think that it was something that I realized that I had more skills than I knew I had. I kind of knew I could do something about it, but didn't know what. But
Mm.
once I got the chance to do it, I took to it, and I think it ended up good for everybody involved.
Mm. Yeah, that is a constancy that the students are doing good work and they're working hard, and we'd like the outside world to know more about it as well as the students. So it's a tough task you took on, but it sounds like you had your heart in the right place, and you made a difference getting more people to the station and getting more of a listening audience.
Yeah, I really tried to do that, and I think it was successful. And I'm not taking credit for bringing a groundswell of people, but I think I got some people involved that wouldn't have been involved otherwise.
Well, that's a tremendous feat, even bringing in one or two people, and then perhaps they bring in more. And that's part of the story of Hofstra Radio, is that we all help each other out. Like you said, when you arrived, Mike Larkin looked at you and said, "Well, okay, here's someone who can learn some things and be active," and then you turn around and do that as well, which is a great thing about. uh, being at a student-run radio station, that you can do that and be the leader pushing on to the next generation. So that's fantastic. So you've mentioned some great names, Mike Larkin and Tony, and who else was around at the time that you were doing some of these positions? Who were the people that you were working with?
Okay, I tried to make a brief list before I got started. Suze, of course, was there. She was hosting the country music show at the time, and the WVHC Country with Suze. And I later ended up working for her for a little bit for Sue Media, and throughout the whole time, she was a presence there, and she's a great lady. I learned a lot from her. Of course, I mentioned Mike and Jeffrey. Then there was a guy named Joe Barone who
Mm,
was a tall stick of a guy with frizzy hair who was a musical genius, and he was amazing. The things that he knew and the way he was around the station. A guy we called Vinny the Blade, whose name was really Mark D'Agostino, and he was called Vinny the Blade because he kind of looked like somebody who should be called Vinny the Blade. Uh, one of his very good friends was Hans Oakes, who was very similar to Vinny the Blade, but the I guess Swedish version of that. And it's interesting because my very first time on the air was as staff announcer for Hans Oakes' jazz show. He hosted a show called The Land of Make Believe, and I was his staff announcer. And you want to talk about learning something from the last person you would think you'd learn anything from. The man did not look like he knew a thing about jazz, and he was very, very knowledgeable, and actually knew a lot about radio too. So I had a good
mm,
time with him. I mentioned Carl Bucking, Tony Sibilla. Uh, when I started doing Airwave and then later on Nightlight and a few of the other evening shows, I would hang out with a woman who was called Kate Kulig. We used to call
hmm
her Misinformation because she was the newscaster. And but she and I started to develop a banter on the air, so we kind of sort of brought the morning show banter to the evening in that stance, and we had a good time with that. There was a guy named Stu Rushfield who used to do some sports and whatever. Was a good guy. Walter Ennis took over as one of the executive engineers, him and Matt Swayhoover. And then, of course, Walter went on to other things at the station. He ended up marrying Barbara Lyons, who was also
hmm
a station manager at the station. You mentioned Jason Levy. I worked very well with Jason. A woman named Michelle Lisi was around there twice when I was there. First as a student when I was an undergrad, and then later on, she was one of the people who was, I believe, operations manager well before John took over,
hmm
somewhere along the line there, and she held that position for a bit. And then later on, when I came back and took the training class back in the 2000s, I worked with people like Andy Gladding and Andrew Falzone, Fran Spencer, who unfortunately recently passed, and
Yeah.
who everybody loved, and of course Bruce and John and Ed and Joe DeRosa and that whole crop of people of that era. So I got to know them. Basha, of course, everyone knows Basha and everyone loves her. I worked with Tony Jackson. I was his engineer for a number of years. Worked with Irv Simner, who used to host Out Behind the Barn. I was his engineer also, so I touched on a lot of people's lives there. It was interesting, and a lot of people's lives touched on me, quite frankly, too. So
Yeah, those are some great names, some wonderful names. I'm sure we could talk all day about all those folks, but I'd like to zero in on your time, and this could be from any of the times you were at the station. But if Hofstra Radio or college radio comes up, is there a story that you always tell about your time at Hofstra Radio?
yes, absolutely. The time that I would get to know the couch in the 4-track studio very intimately, there were many days that I would sign on and sign off the station in the same day.
hmm
And I'll never forget Hurricane Gloria hit. I think it was 1983. And I lived in Franklin Square. I was able to get on a bus and get to the station, sign it on at 8 o'clock in time for the Classics from Hofstra. Somehow I made it there. I don't know how. I was on the air the entire day. The entire day. Nobody else could make it in. So I did all the shifts the whole day, and I signed it off at 2 o'clock in the morning. And that was just such a wonderful and interesting and fun experience for me that, at the time I just kind of did it. But looking back after, like, how did I do that? It was really kind of interesting. But instead of going home, I just slept on the couch, and the very next morning I woke up and signed on the station again. And finally that next day, somebody was able to make their shift. So I kept the station on the air basically through it. And that's really, something I'm proud of, but something was just kind of like, oh, that's what I do. It was just like an afterthought at the time.
Right, right. Was there ever a moment where the station lost power during that? Because that was a big hurricane. That was a big
Yeah.
deal when that happened.
We actually, I think we made it through. The chief engineer at that time was a man named Frank Renstein, I believe,
hmm
and he and Mike had worked out. an auxiliary system of some sort. I didn't know too much about the technicals of keeping us on the air. I just knew I had to be in the studio and make sure the levels were proper and make sure the station stayed broadcasting. So I did my end. And as far as I know, we stayed on the air the whole time.
Wow. And then you must have done all the formats. I mean, you must
Oh,
have followed the
yes. Yeah.
schedule, right?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. To the T. I signed on with classical music. Then we had our hour of public affairs broadcasting. Then I did the jazz show. I believe I read the news that night. Went into more public affairs programming in the early evening. Then did I think Rave Up was the show that the pop rock show in the evening, and then Airwave at night, and signed it off. Yeah,
That's amazing. Wow.
yeah, yeah.
The miracles of youth, I suppose. But were you supposed to be on the air that day, or did you just go in because you knew it needed to be done?
I think it was a little bit of both. I think I had a classical shift, but didn't begin at 8 o'clock. But I said, well, I can make it in, so I'm going to try to make it in and go down to the station in case anybody else can't be in. I think I had the 11 to 2 shift that day, but
Hmm.
I went in for 8 o'clock anyway. And luckily, the person who had 8 o'clock didn't make it. I didn't even stop to ask. I just signed the station on and went on the air.
Wow, it's one of these things that there are so many events that so big news events and weather events and things, but there's something that brings people to the station, and I'm not quite sure what it is, or if it's just the people that are attracted to working in radio and TV are the types that will take a bus in the middle of a hurricane to get to work on time. But I just what is it or what was it that made you spend that entire day keeping the station on the air? Was it point of personal pride, or was it loyalty to the station? What got you through that day?
Well, I mean, it was part of my experience at Hofstra at the time in general. It's the radio station kept me going.
Hmm.
It's why I went to Hofstra. I mean, it's not why I went to Hofstra initially, but
Right.
it became why I went to Hofstra. It became why I would go there every day. So, it was just something that, being the type of person I am, always wanting to be a leader and always trying to find ways to have a leadership opportunity, I created my own. And, and that was my way of being a leader, making sure the station was on the air and kept going.
Wow, that's amazing. My hats off to you. That's a long day, but good for you. And then doing signing on the following day as well. My goodness.
Yeah.
So that's definitely a story that yeah you should always tell. But are there any stories that you rarely tell or don't come up that often that you wouldn't mind sharing?
Yeah, sure. One of my later stints, I was one of the panel on Hofstra's morning wake up call, and it happened to be the morning of 9/11.
Hmm.
And the show ran from 7 to 9 in the morning, and I think the first tower went down at 8:56, right before we signed off the air. And believe it or not, somehow our news guy missed the story, and it wasn't until much later in the day that, of course, the air was filled with all the information about what had happened. But it was kind of ironic in a way that we were laughing and joking about the prior news of the day on such what ended up being such a somber day. And then, so afterwards, we would always make sure that we would double and triple check all the newscasts before we would go off the air, all the news information, making sure everything was up to date. It taught us all a lesson that, radio is not just about having fun; it's about being there when people need you. In fact, it's even more about that. It's more about that intimacy and that, that drive to get that important information out to people and how people need it. Even today, when radio has taken a lot of hard knocks from people and a lot of
Hmm.
criticism, it's still the number one medium when there's a crisis. And that taught us, the people involved in that program and the people at the station at the time, how important that was. To the station's credit, as soon as they realized what had happened, they went on the air and they were wall to wall information on 9/11. By that time, I was back across campus at my job because I worked at Hofstra at the time. And then a few hours later, they sent us all home. But I mean, it was, I, it happened right before we went off the air, and we missed the story. And I always found that very ironic, but luckily the station picked itself up and did what it needed to do the rest of the time, and all that information got out to people.
Hmm. Yeah, it's a weird time of day. Those of us who've worked that day part in news or in broadcasting, that sort of 20 minutes to half hour before 9 a.m., the tone sort of shifts, especially on a morning show. And I know in my particular instance, I was just about done with my shift that morning, and just an odd occurrence kept me on the air a little bit later, and then we carried on through that day. But yeah, it's something about the end of the morning shift and getting to 9 a.m. and going into the next day part that makes you sort of relax and give up I don't know, vigilance is the right word, but gosh, thank you for sharing that. What an experience to go through there. Did you go back to the station at all that day, or were you busy with
No,
your other job?
I went to the office, and then it was the Office of Alumni Relations at Hofstra, and then Hofstra officially closed at 11 a.m. I went home
Yeah,
and took care of things at home and whatever, and then later in the week I went back to the station, obviously, but yeah, that was a strange day.
yeah.
But those of us that survived it learned a lot from it. So I guess it ended up in retrospect being a lesson that we all could use.
Yeah, yeah, amen. Thank you for sharing that. Gosh, um, is there, and again, this could be from any of the eras, any of the times that you were at the station, but is there a song or an event or otherwise that kind of defines? I guess let me focus the question this way on your undergrad days. Is there a song or an event or something that happened while you were still a student at WVHC that kind of defines your time there?
Well, not really. I mean, the whole concept of a shift or a program that ended up being called Nightlight
Hmm.
kind of happened on a Sunday night. Mike Larkin used to do the rock and roll show called Powerhouse from 9 to 11, and then I did the what show was called Night Shift at the time from 11 to 2 on a Sunday night, and I started playing a song by Freuer called Doot Doot. And it was very kind of ethereal and kind of spacey and whatever. And it was in rotation at the station, but for some reason I played it, and Dave Bolender, who was the program director at the time, called me on the air and said, "That's the sound of the new shift that's going to start on Monday." How did you know that? I said, "I didn't know that." I said, "It was just in the rack here, and I played it as part of this program, which because it did fit." And he said, "Yeah, well, that's more of the sound we're going for, more of that lighter, less heavy, less guitar driven sound or whatever." And so that was kind of one memory I had from that. But later on in my experience with WRHU by this time, I remember working on some of the Irish marathons, and I would be
Hmm.
the guy who would give the tally from time to time, and I would always joke how I was from the extreme south of Ireland, Naples. And that was my line, So, and people came to expect it after I said it a couple of years in a row. So I would always have to find the right time to say it when I was on the marathon. So that was kind of my little hook there with that reminds me of the station fondly.
That's great. What a great line. You see, and I just assumed D'Antonio. I assumed that was an Irish name. That's
Of course. Well, how
just
could you not?
bad on me. I guess I should have paid more attention. That's a great line. Oh, that's
And
funny.
of course, McKinley is Italian. Of course, I mean we know
Right,
that.
right, right.
Yeah,
It's
yeah, yeah,
you
sure,
can.
yeah.
Oh, that's great stuff. That's great. The next question, and I guess we could take it for face value, but I might want to flip it around a little bit. The question is, was there ever a time that you thought about leaving or quitting or stepping back? And I guess you can answer that if you want. But I'm also interested, like, what makes you keep coming back to the station time after time? We talked about it a little bit last time, but I'm always interested, in people who are able to make that jump as an adult, as not a student, to jump back into the station and get involved.
Well, radio's in my blood, Brian. I mean,
Mm.
I grew up wanting to be the man in the box when I heard, Dan Ingram from the age of like 3 or 4, and I always wanted to be involved in that. It was the one place I think in my late teens, early 20s, young adulthood, I really felt in place. I really felt that it fit, and it's what I enjoyed doing. Later in life, I ended up getting out of the business, and that's one thing I regret about it. But
Mm.
so every opportunity I had a chance to get back into it, I took. And working back at Hofstra in the early 2000s, I said, let me sample what's happening at the station. So I met Bruce, and we started talking, and he was happy to bring me back on board, provided I take the training class. I said,
Yeah.
wait a second, Bruce, I've been a professional in radio. I've done this and that and this and that. He's like, I don't care. In order to get on the air, you have to take the training class. So I did, and it was quite an interesting experience having to work with people who didn't have as much knowledge. It brought me down a few pegs in my own mind and my own ego, and it made me love it even more because I got to see it from a different set of eyes, I guess, and a different set of ears. And so, anytime I had an opportunity to do that, I did. And one of the things being of the LGBT community and being involved in radio, I brought 2 LGBT themed shows to the station. So those were
Mm.
another reason to get involved because it was a place I can go to get my programming out there as well. And they were initially not as receptive as they should have been on the first one, but by the second one, they were opening the doors for me, saying, "Come on in." So it was an interesting time, but I kept coming back because I love it, and I would come back again in a heartbeat.
Hmm. So was it in the early 2000s when you first came back, when you were working for the alumni relations
Yes.
office? Was that when you tried the first LGBTQ show?
Yeah, well, it was around that time actually. The outreach began in 2006, so I had already
Okay.
stopped working at the university, but I was still working at the station as a community volunteer. And I think Casey Miles was the program director at the time, and
Hmm.
he fought really hard for me to get the show on the air, and he was one of the big people who helped me get that done. But it was interesting. Bruce was receptive to it, but he just said we had to be careful because of the theme.
Hmm.
And of course, yeah, as it happened, it ended up being fine. I lasted about a year or two with that show. It didn't, because it ended up being a lot more, taking up a lot more of my energy and time than I realized it would.
Yeah.
So I had to give it up after a while. But it was a good time. It was a good thing. And then back in 2011, when I came back yet again as a graduate student, no, it's after graduate. I was a community volunteer again. Came back later on as a community volunteer once again, and that was the time that I did Out Loud and Queer.
Hmm.
And that was something that was a music show, so it was a lot easier to do than a magazine program, which the first one was.
Hmm. It, from our standpoint here at the end of 2023 going into 2024, the culture shifted somewhat. That programming like this is not only accepted, it's celebrated and sought after. But going back to 2006, the tone of the culture was very different, and it was a big political thing that some states were going for civil unions or same sex marriages. I remember, I think it was 2004 when Massachusetts had a Supreme Court decision in their state to legalize same-sex marriage as the first state, and there was a tremendous amount of pushback in certain parts of the country, and so forth. So, what I'm trying to get at is the tone was very different, and the expectations were very different, and yet you found people who were willing to help you champion your cause and get the show on the air, and that must have been a nice feeling at the time, but it also must have been frustrating, I imagine.
Yes, it was both. There were a number of meetings among the executive board about whether the program should go on the air. I had a tagline, the queer radio show for everyone. The word queer was a question at the time.
Hmm.
I might have, my years might be a bit off, Brian. It's in that era at some point
Right.
between 2001 2006 at some point. But my year might be a little bit off on that. But I remember at the time it was very difficult getting rolling, but there was always a need for it, and
Yeah.
and there are other programs out there, and there were other programs out there focusing on this segment of the population, but there wasn't one in the Long Island area at the time that was produced locally that was about what was happening on Long Island at the time, and so I learned a lot about the Long Island LGBT community, and I met a lot of people through the show. It was a real good experience, and I think in the end it ended up being something that the station was glad to have on the air. It was interesting though because they scheduled me right between the Irish music show and the reggae show, but I got on the air anyway. So
Interesting, interesting.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it takes a lot to, taking a stand's the wrong phrase, but to get out there and put a show on the air that may not be welcomed with open arms by everyone, but is needed and necessary and helpful for people who are looking for that voice. So good on you for that. That's um, you know uh, the progress of the world sometimes is slower and more difficult than we'd like it to be. But it sounds like you were willing to do that, and I'm guessing part of that was because you, like you said earlier, you felt at home at WRI2 at Hofstra Radio, that you felt a supportive community. So that again must have been nice to have.
Oh, for sure, absolutely. Everyone I met at the station, I took to, and they seemed to take to me, whether it was putting up with me or being happy to be around with me or whatever. But they all took to me as far as I could tell. So yeah, absolutely. It was also I needed to kind of do it for myself, Brian. I
Yeah.
needed to be
Yeah.
myself in the place where I felt comfortable. So it was an opportunity to do, to kind of explore both sides of myself.
Mm. Mm. Thank you for sharing that. That's great. Again, this could be many things, and you've mentioned a number of things that could apply here. But do you have a biggest accomplishment or proudest moment in all your time with Hofstra Radio?
Well, I mentioned her earlier. Fran Spencer was one of the people that I trained. She was in my training class.
Mm,
No, she was in the training class right after mine. That's what it was. I had gone through my training class or whatever, and then she started the next season, and she came in, and I was her. She tracked with me. And I don't know if you remember tracking, but basically
yeah, oh,
that's where they
yeah.
would sit and watch you in for a certain amount of time or whatever. And she always had these doubts about herself. And then once she finally got cleared and started to do things of her own at the station and got on the air, I was so proud of her.
Mm,
And and she just represents a number of other people I work with that came such a long way. And every time you see a young person who walks in the door and is very fearful and then suddenly becomes comfortable on the air, there's a sense of pride in that too. But with Fran, I worked very closely with her to help her get there, so she always made me proud of her. And so that
mm,
that would be, I would say, she comes to mind, but there were others as well.
mm. That's that's amazing to hear because so many people I've talked to, whether for this program or otherwise, mention her as being a wonderful mentor and friend, and really taking these young students in as members of her family. And so many people were really forthcoming with stories like this when she passed, and to know that you had a role in making her comfortable at the station, and then she therefore passed that forward to so many more people. That's wow, what a legacy. Hmm.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Well, she was a great lady, and
Hmm.
that's all really, that sums it all up. It's the truth.
Hmm. Wow, thank you for sharing that. um Let me turn the tables a little bit here. Are there funny events or funny stories or things that happened during your time at Hofstra Radio that still make you laugh to this day, or you think of something and you're just like, oh boy, that was something else.
A couple of quick ones. Someone saying Dmitry Shostakovich on the air instead of Dmitry Shostakovich. I don't remember who it was, but every time I think about that, I'm like, oh my God, how uneducated is this person? But then you realize that you have to step back and say, wait a second, it's our fault for not teaching the person the right way. So it sounded funny, it sounded kind of pathetic at the time, but then you need to think, well, okay, maybe that's where we failed, so we need to do a better job with clearing that person before they went on the air. And then there was a story at one of the WVHC WRHU dinners, if I remember correctly. I think it was the one where we made the flip from VHC to RHU.
Hmm.
Uh, Somebody showed up in a gorilla suit, and I still don't remember the whole story, but I know that it had something to do with Jeffrey and Mike Larkin, and one getting back at the other for something. I don't know. It was really silly, but we did a lot of silly things back then. Specifics don't necessarily pop into my mind so much, but there was a lot of fun that we had in general, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, you've gone back to the station a number of times, so I think I know the answer to this, but it's a hypothetical. If you were asked to go back to WRHU or to fill in a spot, first question, would you do it? Second question, if yes, what kind of program would you want to produce or host?
I'd do it in a heartbeat, and I'd play, as much of the classic airwave stuff as I could, because
Yeah.
I think that music really kind of defined that era at the station. It was the one that, I mean, we did it before LAR did it. Back then, LAR was the Dare to Be Different station, and they were playing a whole bunch of music that we had already played. So it was kind of like, we were at the edge, and that's such an important time in the history of the station that I would love to do a show focusing on that type of music.
I would tune in for that in a heartbeat. That would be awesome. What do you miss most about your time at Hofstra Radio?
Um, Doing radio and being around the people with such a passion as I did. When
Yeah.
you're around people who share your passion, you always want to be there. It's and that's for sure. No matter what era I was there were people that shared that passion that I had, and that's why I always felt comfortable there.
Hmm. Great. If you could go back in time, well, we'll start with undergrad Mike. If you could go back in time for 60 seconds and say to yourself at 18 or 19 years old, here's a piece of advice. What would you share with a younger version of yourself?
Don't be so quick to leave the business. Don't be
Mm,
so quick to say, oh, I can't make a living at this. Don't believe all the negatives that people say about you or that you say about yourself. That's my biggest regret, Brian. I think is leaving the business in the first place, because it's so tough to get back into, and it's something that I've been wanting to for a long, long time, and I've had dips back in and back out for a number of reasons that will remain unspoken. But yeah, definitely, I would say that whatever you do, stick it out. This is the right path for you, because again, it's still at this age, and I'll be 60 in March. So at this age, I still yearn to be in the business.
Yeah, I think once it gets in you, it's there. But it's a tough business, and I dare say it's probably gotten tougher over the years with various changes to technology and ownership and things like that. It's harder to have a lasting career, so it's hard. But do you remember when you were a student? Did you have conversations with Jeff or anybody else about working in the commercial business? And I think you went and worked with Mike Larkin at WBLI for a stretch. Is that right? Do you
That's
remember
correct.
having
Yes.
conversations with those guys or anybody else about a future in radio?
Yeah, but you know what? It was kind of funny because when I was an undergrad, Mike, I had a lack of confidence, and I didn't really want to talk about myself that much. So I
Mm,
really never really did that. I kind of sort of, like I said, Greg Fennell helped me get my first job in the radio business. I moved up to New Hampshire to work at a radio station he was working at. And so I said, okay, good, I'm in now. So now I don't have to worry about it. Now once I'm in, right? Of course, that was a stupid thing to think because I was out of that station in about 8 months. But I mean, at the time, it just seemed I didn't need to worry about it. I would just talk to a couple of people. I did talk to Mike and Jeff a little bit about it, but they would always have a way of kind of focusing on other things and focusing on other people and whatever. And I kind of did it to myself. I didn't advocate enough for myself when I was younger, Brian. I should have done a better job of that.
mm, mm. Yeah, it's a tough place to be because the job and the career need a lot of confidence and I guess a certain amount of hubris to get where you need to be. But it's also a time in life where we're unsure of each other. But thank you for sharing that. Yeah, that's tough. But you did go on to do some radio and do many other things, including teaching. What did you bring from Hofstra Radio into your career and into your grown-up life?
uh, the love of communicating.
Yeah.
If you haven't figured it out yet, I like to talk, and I learned how to do so in a professional manner and in a truthful manner. I learned that it's as important as it is to talk. It's also more important to listen. And one of the things that being a show host at RHU and BHC taught me was how to listen. Because a good interviewer knows how to listen to his people as much as how to talk to them, and so I take that with me, and especially in teaching. You don't know if you've reached a student until you really listen to what they have to say. And if you don't know how to do that, then you're not a successful teacher or good in any kind of business, really. So I think that's the biggest thing, the proper way to communicate, both how to speak and how to listen.
Hmm. Yeah, and then you find out different ways to, for yourself to communicate as you listen. And you said this earlier that you listened to other people who were at the station, and you went to different programs where there was John Mike in the radio program or whatever it was that you were listening, that you were taking these things and absorbing them. I'm sure you use those things today, all the things that you've absorbed, and like you said, talking with your students and communicating, whether it's the written word or the spoken word. I think you've taken a lot of that with you along the way.
Absolutely. I'll still find myself turning on my radio voice from time to time.
Well. God bless you for it. I mean, what you said earlier that you and Kate Kulig used to do a like a morning banter kind of thing in the evenings. I was like, I'd listen to that because those are two great voices, and you guys must have sounded awesome together.
We did. We got really silly on the air, but we had a good time. Yeah.
Mike, thank you so much for your stories and your time. This was an absolute blast. I really appreciate this, and uh,
Well, thanks, Brian. I'm glad you have me here at the Hofstra Radio Alumni Audio Yearbook. And hopefully everyone listening enjoys this program and has a great time. And thanks for making me a part of it again. I appreciate it. Have a great one.